What if we finally got the answer to humanity's oldest and most haunting question? What if the mystery of death, the one boundary no one ever crossed with certainty, was solved, not by faith, not by myth, but by science? Imagine waking up to headlines blaring life after death, proven by physicists. Not a theory, not speculation, proof, verified, repeated, peer-reviewed. Death, no longer the end. 1 year ago, the world stopped. A team of researchers, quantum theorists, neurosurgeons, and consciousness experts had done what seemed impossible. Using an experimental quantum field mapping process combined with real-time brain death monitoring and non-local consciousness tracking, they uncovered undeniable evidence that human awareness continues after the body dies. The afterlife, or something eerily like it, was real, and every major scientific body on Earth backed the finding. Within hours, the planet erupted. Panic, euphoria, riots, mass celebrations, existential dread. It all happened at once. Governments scrambled to manage the chaos. Religious leaders either claimed validation or collapsed under doubt. And the digital world caught fire with debates, breakdowns, and a new wave of spiritual influences. But that was only day one. Now, it's 1 year later. The dust has settled, somewhat, but the world has changed, irrevocably. This is what life looks like when we know death isn't the end. But to understand this new reality, we need to go back to the moment it all broke open. The moment science shattered the veil of the unknown. It began quietly, almost too quietly for a discovery that would append the entire trajectory of human history. The location, Geneva, Switzerland. The team, an elite coalition of neuroscientists, quantum theorists, and AI researchers operating under the multinational Continuum Project. Their goal was audacious: to map the boundaries of consciousness and test whether awareness persisted in the brain after clinical death. For years, skeptics scoffed, but in June of that fateful year, their breakthrough emerged, not in a headline, but in a lab log. A subject, codenamed Omega-7, flatlined, total brain activity ceased, clinically dead for 6 minutes, and yet, the data kept recording. Something continued to interact with the observation field, a conscious, directed response, measured not through imagination or hallucination, but through a controlled neural feedback device designed to capture non-physical information exchange. The pattern was intelligent, self-aware, and it carried one chilling, verifiable piece of evidence. It repeated a precise 19-digit number the subject had never encountered while alive, a number randomly generated and locked away in a quantum-encrypted vault, which the subject somehow accessed only after death. The implications were staggering. The results were repeated across multiple facilities, with dozens of volunteers, terminal patients who willingly participated, time and again. Subjects returned with detailed information inaccessible through natural means, always post-mortem, and always verified by independent labs. Skeptics demanded replication. Replication came. The Royal Society, CERN, Harvard, and Tokyo University all reviewed the Continuum Project's methods and independently verified the results. Within weeks, the Journal of Consciousness Research published what would become the most controversial and most downloaded paper in human history: Post-Biological Cognitive Continuity in Verified Non-Local Consciousness States. Translation: we go on, somehow, somewhere. Publicly, it was announced by the United Nations' newly formed Global Scientific Council on Death. A grim-looking panel of experts stood before cameras and delivered the line that would haunt or heal billions. The data confirms, with high confidence and statistical significance, that human consciousness persists beyond clinical death. Death is no longer the end, it is a transition. The world broke, instantly. News outlets scrambled to make sense of it. Was it heaven? Reincarnation? A parallel dimension? Could you interact with it? Was it one collective state, or billions of individualized afterlives? The scientists refused to speculate. They only offered the evidence, and the warning that interpretation would be humanity's next great challenge. In the days following, the global information ecosystem erupted. Twitter, Reddit, and TikTok became spiritual battlegrounds. Some claimed vindication. Religious communities rejoiced, especially those with beliefs in eternal life. Others panicked, certain a discovery confirmed hell. Mental health hotlines crashed. Conspiracy theorists spun elaborate new doctrines overnight, and for every thoughtful conversation, there were 10,000 reaction videos, think pieces, and pseudoscientific cults flooding the discourse. Governments around the world reacted with urgency and confusion. Some declared national days of reflection, others, fearing unrest, moved swiftly to censor or control the narrative. Markets crashed. Faith institutions scrambled. New laws were proposed, mostly to regulate how the afterlife could be discussed in media, fearing it would incite exits, spiritual extremism, or even warfare. And yet, amidst the chaos, a new kind of calm began to rise in pockets of the world. People began living differently. Suddenly, what came after seemed just as real as what was now. Old rules lost power. New philosophies took root. Death no longer felt like an abyss. It was a door. And this was just the beginning. But knowing we live on after death doesn't simply change how we think, it changes how we feel. The real shockwave wasn't scientific, it was psychological. Let's dive into the minds of a species that just lost its final mystery. The proof of an afterlife didn't just shift academic discourse or religious doctrine. It detonated the human psyche. 1 year later, the psychological landscape of the planet is unrecognizable. At first, people didn't know how to feel. For centuries, fear of death had been the engine of human behavior. It drove ambition, morality, risk, restraint, and even love. It gave life urgency. Now, that fear had a rival, certainty, but with that certainty came a new void of meaning. Some found instant peace. These individuals, let's call them the embracers, began to live with a serenity bordering on bliss. Death no longer scared them. It reassured them. They volunteered more, forgave faster, and let go of their egos. Exit rates among this group decreased, not out of fear, but from a newfound sense of purpose. Many said that knowing they'd continue after death made them want to improve their legacy in this life. But others spiraled. They were the seekers. For them, this discovery unraveled everything. If this world was only the beginning, what was the point? These individuals experienced intense existential breakdowns. Therapists coined a new term, CDS, or Continuity Disassociation Syndrome, a form of derealization where the mind becomes detached from earthly experiences, overwhelmed by the implications of eternal continuation. Those suffering from CDS felt alienated from their own lives, as if their daily routines had become meaningless theater before a far greater act to come. Exit rates also rose, but not from despair. A disturbing trend emerged. Afterlife acceleration, people wanted to skip ahead to the next phase, especially among terminally ill, deeply religious, or emotionally unstable individuals. The idea that death is just a doorway became a rational excuse for early exit. Governments were forced to launch global campaigns, urging people not to treat death like a destination vacation. Meanwhile, philosophy departments saw a renaissance. Ethics lectures overflowed. Demand for existential literature exploded. Old books by Camus, Kierkegaard, and even Dante shot to the top of bestseller lists. Simultaneously, new thinkers rose, self-proclaimed after philosophers proposing frameworks for how to live when death isn't final. Mental health services underwent a massive restructuring. Therapy models that once focused on fear of mortality now had to treat fear of immortality. Psychologists revised the 5 stages of grief, death, acceptance. That was obsolete. Now came a 6th stage, reintegration. The process of emotionally aligning one's identity with the knowledge of post-death continuity. Children, especially, were uniquely affected. Imagine growing up knowing for a fact that death isn't the end. Educational institutions scrambled to introduce age-appropriate modules on transitional awareness, teaching kids to approach life with curiosity about the next phase, without romanticizing it. But not all systems adapted quickly. In parts of the world where education lagged or dogma dominated, the psychological shock among the young became dangerously unstable. Some even forming doomsday cults under the illusion that they could fast-track their purpose. Dream research also saw an explosion of interest. Sleep studies suggested that dreams became more vivid and prophetic in the months after the discovery. Some theorized it was the subconscious beginning to attune to what lay beyond, though this was widely disputed. Nevertheless, lucid dreaming communities flourished, believing dreams now had an afterlife resonance, like rehearsals for what comes next. But the most profound change, time perception, with death no longer a hard stop. humanity lost its deadline. That might sound like a good thing, but for many, it wasn't. Procrastination surged. Motivation plummeted. If life was merely chapter 1 of an endless book, why rush through anything? Productivity in creative industries suffered. The hustle culture imploded. A new movement emerged. Temporal minimalism, the idea that rushing, optimizing, and stressing were relics of a death-fearing past. Do less, but deeply, became its mantra. And yet, paradoxically, another movement gained traction. Legacy maximalism. These individuals wanted to leave behind as much as possible before transitioning. They didn't fear death, but they feared being forgotten by those still living. As a result, memoir writing, archival video recording, and digital immortality services boomed. People treated their earthly lives like curated exhibits for the living, knowing they'd move on. But others wouldn't. In the end, one truth became clear. The fear of death hadn't vanished. It had merely evolved. But while individuals struggled with identity and meaning, the old titans of belief, the religions of the world, faced a different crisis. Some saw prophecy fulfilled. Others saw their foundations crumble. And all had to decide, how do you worship when the afterlife is no longer a mystery, but a fact? The moment the scientific world declared proof of life after death, every religion on earth was forced into a moment of reckoning. For many, it was validation, divine confirmation wrapped in data. For others, it was a theological earthquake that split centuries-old traditions right down the middle. Within a year, religious landscapes across the globe had transformed. Some growing, some fracturing, all adapting. Christianity, long rooted in the promise of eternal life, reacted swiftly. Many sects saw the discovery as proof of divine truth. "We told you death wasn't the end," they declared. Megachurches incorporated scientific references into their sermons. Evangelism took on a new fervor, not to convert people from disbelief, but to help them prepare for a now verified next life. But not all Christians agreed on what the data meant. Did it confirm heaven or purgatory? Something else entirely. A schism emerged, the empirical gospel, a rising movement within Christianity that blended scripture with scientific interpretation, forming a hybrid theology that emphasized preparation for the quantified soul journey. Islam, with its strong emphasis on the afterlife, experienced a similar internal split. Traditional scholars debated whether the empirical afterlife aligned with the Quranic descriptions of Jannah, or paradise, and Jahannam, or hell. The fact that the scientific findings didn't describe a dualistic reward-punishment system unsettled some. Progressive imams began promoting reinterpretations of classical doctrine, suggesting that the afterlife described by science might only be the first level of the hereafter, with spiritual consequences unfolding further beyond measurable observation. Meanwhile, more orthodox branches resisted reinterpretation, branding the scientific data as incomplete or misleading. Hinduism, with its long history of reincarnation and spiritual continuity, experienced a renaissance. The Continuum discovery aligned almost perfectly with long-held beliefs about the soul's journey beyond the physical realm. Gurus and spiritual leaders found new audiences as younger generations, previously skeptical, now sought ancient wisdom with fresh eyes. Temples reported record-breaking attendance, and Sanskrit texts were retranslated to align with modern scientific language. Even some Western scientists began studying the Vedas for insight, fascinated by how a millennia-old tradition had predicted non-local consciousness all along. Buddhism, too, found harmony with the discovery, the idea of consciousness persisting beyond death, independent of ego or identity, reflected many Buddhist teachings. However, the danger of spiritual materialism increased. Rather than trying to lose sense of self, some began fetishizing the afterlife as a playground of consciousness, missing the deeper message of detachment and evanescence. Buddhist leaders launched global initiatives to remind followers that proof of continuity does not replace the need for mindfulness in the present. Judaism, with its varied views on the afterlife across different branches, responded more cautiously. Rabbinical councils debated the implications for Olam Haba, the world to come. Some saw the discovery as supporting the concept of a soul that moves beyond this world, while others warned that scientific descriptions lacked moral dimension. What good is an afterlife? They argued, without judgment or justice. But not every reaction was measured or moderate. Within weeks, entirely new religions began to form, Some were benign, spiritual communities dedicated to understanding the structure of the afterlife, blending meditation, science, and philosophy. Others were dangerous. Cults emerged, most infamously, the Path Beyond, a doomsday group that encouraged mass exit to ascend to the verified plane. Governments in multiple countries were forced to outlaw certain practices, implement afterlife, safety laws, and monitor online radicalization fueled by spiritual distortion. And then there were the atheists and agnostics, or, rather, the people formerly known as such. For decades, the godless perspective had often been conflated with disbelief in anything beyond the physical. But with scientific proof of a continued consciousness, new identities emerged. The empirical continuationist became a defined philosophical stance, someone who believes in a post-death state without attributing it to gods or deities. Many former atheists became spiritual without becoming religious, embracing the data without leaping to dogma. A curious trend emerged from this group. They called afterlife agnosticism. While accepting the continuation of consciousness, they refused to assign meaning to it. We don't know if it's a reward, a trap, or a glitch, they said. All we know is that we continue. The Vatican, for its part, stunned the world with an unprecedented announcement. In a globally televised address, the Pope declared the findings a gift of grace through science, urging believers not to see the data as competition to faith, but as complement. However, behind closed doors, leaks revealed internal chaos. Doctrinal councils feared that with heaven proven, hell might be next, a revelation that could change everything again. Meanwhile, a quiet movement grew beneath the surface, the silence doctrine. Adherents believed humanity was not yet ready for full truth, that speaking too openly about the afterlife distorted its purpose. They advocated for sacred silence, minimal speculation, and the creation of new holy orders of study, similar to ancient monastic traditions, who would slowly, carefully interpret the discovery over generations. 1 year later, the global religious map had been redrawn. Ancient faiths evolved or fragmented, new beliefs flourished, skeptics turned spiritual. Millions began to treat death not as a fearsome unknown, but as a place they knew they would one day return to. But when the rules of death change, so too must the rules of life. And as beliefs shifted, so did laws, ethics, and the structure of society itself. What happens to civilization when morality is no longer about survival, but preparation? When death lost its mystery, society lost its anchor. Everything that once depended on mortality, morality, punishment, responsibility, had to be reimagined from the ground up. In less than a year, the world's legal and ethical foundations crumbled and reformed, and it all started with one haunting question. If we continue after death, what happens to justice? Courts struggled. For centuries, punishment relied on finality, prison as deterrent, execution as closure. But now, with death reframed as transition, defense attorneys mounted radical arguments. You can't take a life if life doesn't end. Some countries erupted in outrage. Others quietly rewrote the very definition of sentencing. Entire fields of law shifted. New doctrines emerged. Ideas like post-biological consequence theory, where punishments must carry over to the next life, and continuity responsibility, which extended accountability beyond the grave. A few jurisdictions even tested death suspension units, facilities where prisoners were temporarily euthanized and revived. The goal: induce reflection by simulating the after-death experience. Critics called it psychological torture dressed as reform. Still, the experiments spread. Ethics committees were overwhelmed. Philosophers, judges, theologians, and neuroscientists debated the unthinkable. Should actions in one life affect your rights in the next? Can testimony from the afterlife be admissible if retrieved by revived subjects? Should governments regulate messages from the other side? If life is no longer singular, what does it even mean to live justly? But law wasn't the only thing cracking. Culture fractured and reformed just as violently. Marriage lost its terminal punctuation. The phrase "till death do us part" fell apart. Some couples extended their bonds into eternity through what became known as continuity partnerships. Others abandoned structure altogether, choosing polyamory or solitude in favor of spiritual alignment. Parenting shifted too. Some began to see children not just as offspring, but as souls choosing their path through this reality. In some cultures, naming ceremonies gave way to soul intention rituals, where parents attempted to interpret their child's purpose in this lifetime. Even death itself was redesigned. Funerals became transition celebrations, complete with holographic farewells and AI-generated avatars. In wealthier regions, families could commission neuroechopods, devices that replay the final conscious patterns of the departed before they transitioned, creating a spiritual last voicemail. Phrases like "passed away" or "rest in peace" began to fade. Entertainment flooded with afterlife narratives, not imaginative but declarative. A new genre, post-continuity fiction, took over streaming platforms. Shows like Beyond the Veil and Echo Frame didn't fear death. They started with it. The tone, half mystery, half therapy, and part sacred ritual. Language too evolved. What we used to say, "passed away," faded. People now said, "she moved on," or "he's on the other side." Even cursing transformed. The phrase, "what the hell," turned into, "what dimension," and "go to hell" became, "see you in the review chamber." But perhaps the deepest shift was the rise of death literacy, a movement built on demystifying what comes next. Schools began offering continuity studies. Children learned about spiritual traditions, not as religion, but as navigational tools. In some places, kids kept afterlife journals, mapping how they'd live differently, knowing death wasn't the end, yet not everything improved. With fear of death gone, thrill-seeking surged. Risky stunts, dangerous sports, and illegal challenges exploded online under the hashtag #DoorJump trend. Videos of people intentionally flirting with death just to see what's next. Some didn't come back, others did, and they weren't the same. The stories they brought back varied wildly, often distorted, sometimes disturbing, and never verifiable in full. Governments launched sweeping public safety campaigns with one brutal slogan: "Just because death isn't the end doesn't mean life doesn't matter." But it was too late. The old foundation, scarcity, survival, finality, was gone. Civilization had to become something entirely new. But while morality twisted and culture adapted, one thing shattered completely: the economy. Because when death loses its sting, what happens to all the industries built on fear? If death was once the world's most profitable certainty, its dethroning triggered economic chaos. 1 year after science confirmed the afterlife, the global economy is still trembling. Markets built on mortality, time scarcity, and risk are either collapsing, mutating, or giving rise to bizarre new industries that barely resemble capitalism as we knew it. Insurance was the first to fall. Life insurance, once a bedrock of security, imploded. Why pay to protect your loved ones from the unknown when death is now seen as a continuation, not a loss? Millions canceled their policies overnight. In a scramble to stay relevant, providers rebranded themselves as transition support funds, selling packages for afterlife, preparation, digital legacy services, and grief counseling, not for the dead, but for the living left behind. Health insurance spiraled next, with consciousness confirmed to persist. Many terminal patients began refusing expensive end-of-life care. Their logic was simple: why bankrupt your family to stretch out a few painful weeks when the next chapter is waiting? In countries without universal health care, this mindset exploded. Hospitals reported sharp increases in patients opting for what they called peaceful passage over medical prolonging. The funeral industry collapsed. Coffin sales dried up. Embalming became outdated. In its place rose afterlife concierge services, companies offering spiritual send-offs, digital farewell platforms, and neural recordings for post-mortem interaction. Cremation stayed popular, but its purpose evolved. Ashes were used to forge legacy crystals. Biotech gems that stored fragments of neural frequency, marketed as literal soul echoes. Tech giants, smelling opportunity, pounced. Google launched Anima, an AI that mimics your personality using voice notes, search, history, and neural data to create a posthumous version of you. Meta followed with Beyond VR, a hyper-personalized digital afterlife simulator built from revived subjects' brainwave feedback, letting users preview what might lie beyond the veil. But the strangest boom came from afterlife investment platforms. Yes, people started buying stock in eternity. These platforms offered portfolios based on post-life assets, like experimental biotech to stabilize your consciousness after death. digital real estate in simulated afterlife realms, or devices aiming to communicate across dimensions. Whether scams or revolutions, the market exploded with believers. Cryptocurrency mutated too. Enter soul coins, digital tokens for ethereal exchange, speculatively valued on spiritual energy, dimensional reach, or psychic influence. Some hit billion-dollar valuations within months. Faith, greed, and FOMO, or fear of missing out, became the new fuel of finance. Even religion turned entrepreneurial. The Vatican introduced continuity preparation retreats, blending Christian doctrine with neuroscience. Priced like spiritual luxury spas, ashrams across Asia offered meditative intensives and afterlife training. Wealthy elites invested in clarity portfolios, carefully curated belief systems promising emotional peace in the next phase. Education adapted just as fast. New university degrees emerged: afterlife theory, continuity law, and post-death communication ethics. Economists began modeling multi-life productivity, arguing that human potential now stretches across dimensions, so long-term planning shouldn't stop at death. The labor market twisted in strange directions. Productivity plummeted. Without death as a deadline, urgency disappeared. People walked away from careers, not to escape, but to pursue higher callings. Sabbaticals became the norm. Soul coaches flourished, helping people find jobs that resonate across lifetimes. Still, some industries exploded overnight. Dream mapping startups sold apps to track and interpret spiritual paths. Psychedelic therapy clinics popped up everywhere, legally offering DMT and psilocybin to simulate afterlife states. Transitional luxury brands sold ornate departure robes, soul scent oils, and dimensional diaries to those preparing for their next journey. The old economy was dying. A new one was rising, built not on fear, but on the monetization of eternity. But beneath the glow of spiritual capitalism, something darker stirred. As always, where money flows, corruption follows. Fraudulent profits emerged. Cults gained power. Black markets for neural data formed. And most disturbing of all, corporations began positioning themselves to control access to the afterlife itself, because not everyone responded with peace. For some, the proof of life beyond death became an obsession. For others, it became a weapon. Now, we enter the shadows, where the afterlife is no longer sacred, but strategic. While some embraced the confirmed afterlife with reflection and reverence, others saw something else entirely: chaos, profit, power. Within 12 months, the world witnessed an unsettling surge of obsession, radical behavior, and sinister new systems engineered around what lies beyond. At the heart of this transformation emerged a new kind of human, the obsessives. For them, this life became just a warm-up. They chased practices and experiences they believed would prime them for the next realm. Some even tried to hack the process itself, treating the afterlife as a system waiting to be gamed. The most chilling outcome: voluntary departure movements, small but rapidly growing collectives, began forming worldwide, encouraging ritualized exits as spiritual ascension. Their message: if death is just a door, why wait, especially if Earth no longer feels like home? Governments moved swiftly to outlaw them, but online communities spread the ideology in coded hashtags like the Great Return, Crossers, and Echo Jumpers. Not everyone just wanted to enter the afterlife. Some wanted to control it. Corporations rushed in with promises to manage your transition. One biotech firm, Aurora Corp, advertised continuity mapping, a neural alignment protocol designed to fine-tune your consciousness before death. Another startup offered post-death navigation training through immersive VR experiences built on revived subject data. None of it could be truly verified, but it didn't matter. The money poured in. Then came the gatekeepers. A circle of global elites began hoarding data allegedly extracted from post-return subjects, people who had been clinically dead, revived, and then subjected to deep neural mining. These recordings, if real, were said to contain fragments of what lies beyond: images, sensations, even coordinates. The data was locked behind private servers and paywalls, accessible only to those who could afford membership in exclusive Beyond Knowledge clubs. Inside these circles, luxury and mysticism merged. Clients were guided through preparation chambers, opulent environments featuring AI-led meditations, light therapy, and biochemical soul alignment protocols. A single session cost more than an annual salary. It wasn't just status, it was marketed as spiritual advantage. Naturally, a black market surged in response. Hackers breached soul tech companies and sold stolen neural data online as soul scans. In unregulated zones, underground dealers offered fake afterlife access keys, implants, ritual objects, or neural gear that promised power over your destination after death. Most were scams. Some weren't. Even darker was what emerged in war zones. Post-mortem warfare. Militant groups began justifying violence as accelerated transition. If death was no longer the end, they claimed, then killing wasn't murder, it was passage. Extremists reframed martyrdom as direct entry to a confirmed second life. But it wasn't just fanatics. Even nihilists, stripped of meaning in this reality, unleashed violence under the logic that none of it mattered anymore, because we all continue regardless. Governments panicked. Intelligence agencies created task forces to monitor spiritual radicalization. The United Nations convened an emergency council to address existential threat vectors, placing obsessive afterlife behavior on the same threat level as terrorism and nuclear escalation. Media only made things worse. News outlets pumped out fear bait like what happens if you die angry, and 10 afterlife testimonies you won't believe. Talk shows hosted revived subjects who spoke in cryptic riddles, fueling dread instead of clarity. And then there was social media. What began as curiosity dissolved into spectacle. Live-streamed exits, countdown videos of after-death messages, influencers branding themselves as spiritual pioneers. One platform, Beyond Net, surged in popularity, an online space where users claimed to commune with the dead through guided hallucinations, AI trance states, or dream encryption protocols. Society fractured. On one side were those trying to live wisely, meaningfully, with deeper purpose. On the other were those addicted to the crossing itself, compelled by the mystery, desperate for control. And in the middle, millions drifted, unsure what to believe, unsure how to live when permanence was gone and nothing felt grounded anymore. But is this the end, or just the rebirth? In the final chapter, we ask, has the human spirit shattered under the weight of truth, or is something entirely new beginning to emerge? It has now been 1 year since the veil was torn down, since humanity's most sacred question received its most devastating answer. The proof of life after death didn't bring peace, it brought fire. A storm, and in that storm, we saw a reflection, one that showed us not only what we are, but everything we fear to become. Today, the world stares into that reflection, unsure if it sees evolution or unraveling. The chaos of the early months, riots, cults, economic collapse, ideological warfare, has faded into something quieter. Not peace, but adaptation. The old systems haven't vanished, they've mutated. Morality, religion, law, and economics no longer lean on the fear of death. They now rest on the assumption that this life is just one of many. Vital, yes, but no longer final. In developed nations, a new introspective renaissance has taken root. People are turning inward, not to religion, but to integration. The central question has shifted. No longer what happens when I die, but what will I bring with me when I do? Concepts like soul hygiene and ethical carryover dominate modern self-help. Success is no longer measured by achievement, but by resonance, by the kind of echo a life can create. Yet beneath the spiritual awakening, a quiet despair lingers. For some, eternity is a gift. For others, it's a sentence. If there is no end, when do we rest? If we persist forever, what does it mean to be fulfilled? Many are realizing that the fear of death was not just terror, it was also permission. Permission to stop. Permission to let go. That permission is gone. Now, there's always more. Always something next. This realization has sparked a new field of existential philosophy, continuity fatigue, the psychological toll of never-ending awareness. Thinkers debate whether the soul can burn out, whether eternal consciousness is sustainable. Two major camps have emerged: the Eternalists, who welcome infinite becoming, and the Terminists, who believe even a soul must have an endpoint, and are now seeking it. Globally, the race has changed. Nations no longer compete for land, but for spiritual capital. Some invest heavily in education programs focused on post-death preparedness. Others fund national programs for soul development. Marginalized cultures, once dismissed as primitive, are now rebranded as continuity sciences. Ancient wisdom becomes strategic value. Beliefs once ignored become economic leverage. Out of the wreckage, new institutions rise. The World Continuity Council regulates global research and ethics related to post-death existence. The Dimensional Ethics Tribunal mediates cases involving testimony from revived individuals. The Academy of Soul Studies becomes the first university fully dedicated to consciousness beyond biology. Culturally, this is being called the Second Enlightenment, not one of reason over faith, but of integration, of merging science and spirit into something larger. Critics argue that chaos hasn't ended, it's just become more philosophical. But art has flourished. Music, theater, and film now explore the liminal, the in-between. A new wave of continuity theater emerges, telling stories from the perspective of souls mid-transition. Many of these works refuse to end, echoing the uncertainty of the next phase, even when we know it exists. Amid it all, a new kind of human is beginning to emerge. They are not defined by nation, class, or faith. They are not driven by fear or greed. They live by resonance. They don't ask, what can I get from this life? But what part of me will survive it? And what kind of echo do I want to become? Maybe this is what evolution truly looks like. Not technological, not political, but ontological. The rise of a being aware not just of what they do, but of what they become. And still, one question continues to haunt the background of this transformation, a question that lingers in the silence long after the science has spoken. Now that we know we continue, do we still remember how to live? Because when the headlines fade, when the systems, the science, and the speculation fall silent, only one truth remains. The choices we make in every breath, every moment, every version of ourselves. What kind of soul will I leave behind? And who will I be when I return? 1 year ago, humanity crossed a threshold it never expected to reach. We proved the unprovable. We stared into the unknown, and it stared back. The afterlife, once the domain of myth and faith, became scientific fact. And in that single revelation, everything changed. Faith, law, love, fear, purpose, all rewritten. But the truth didn't bring peace. It brought complexity. We now live in a world where death is not an ending, but a doorway. Every action we take, every thought we have, may ripple beyond this lifetime into the next. Morality is no longer shaped by the fear of punishment, but by the weight of knowing we continue. Some grew wiser, others more reckless. Civilization didn't collapse, it transformed, and so did we. The final lesson, 1 year later, is this: even with all the answers, the mystery remains. Not in what happens when we die, but in how we choose to live, now that we know we don't stop. If this story made you question your purpose, rethink your beliefs, or see life a little differently, then hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment below. What would you do if you knew, truly knew, that death was just the beginning? Would you change your legacy? Live slower or faster? Fear more, or finally live without fear? Let us know. And remember, this is just one version of reality. We've got hundreds more waiting for you. See you in the next life,